Can a civilization survive without memory? Not simply survive biologically, not merely continue to have cities, governments, schools, businesses, and millions of people going about their daily lives. I mean something deeper. Can a civilization lose much of its memory and still fully understand itself? Imagine for a moment that tomorrow morning you wake up with your intelligence intact. You can speak, you can work, you can use your phone. You remember how to drive and how to perform your profession, but you cannot remember your parents. You cannot remember your grandparents. You do not know where you were born, where your family came from, what experiences shaped you, or why you believe many of the things you believe. You still possess abilities, but answering one apparently simple question becomes remarkably difficult. Who am I? I sometimes wonder whether something similar can happen collectively. A civilization requires more than roads, governments, and economies. It also depends on memory. People inherit languages, stories, values, institutions, historical experiences, and explanations of where they came from. These things create continuity between generations. And for many Africans, I believe that continuity has been severely disrupted. We may know something about slavery, we know something about colonialism, we know the names of independence leaders and the dates when modern African states became independent. But then comes a surprisingly difficult question. What came before? Who were the people from whom our families descended? How did they organize communities? How did they govern? What did they trade? What technologies did they develop? How did they raise children? What languages did they speak? What institutions did they create? How did they understand morality, spirituality, justice, responsibility, and belonging? And how did they respond to the problems of their own time? For many people, there is an enormous historical silence where the answers to those questions should be. That silence matters. Because when you begin your understanding of African history with slavery or colonialism, Africans enter the story at the moment when something is being done to them. They appear as enslaved people, colonized people, converted people, administered people, liberated people. But human beings existed before those descriptions. African societies were building, governing, trading, migrating, arguing, creating, worshipping, fighting, experimenting, and adapting long before Europeans established colonial governments on the continent. Recognizing that does not require us to romanticize pre-colonial Africa. Our ancestors were human beings, not superheroes. African societies experienced warfare, political struggles, inequality, competition, internal divisions, and practices that many of us would strongly reject today. But they also possessed something extremely important: agency. They were participants in history, not merely characters in somebody else's story. And I think recovering that distinction is essential. Because history does more than tell us what happened. History helps locate us within the human story. It tells us that people before us faced problems, made decisions, created institutions, succeeded at some things, and failed at others. It reminds us that the present did not simply appear from nowhere. This is one of the ideas that sits behind broken ancestry. The argument is not that Africans should reject everything foreign and retreat into some imaginary version of the past. That would simply replace one form of intellectual dependence with another. The deeper question is what happens when ancestry, history, spirituality, and identity become disconnected? What happens when people inherit fragments of themselves but no longer understand how those fragments fit together? And perhaps more importantly, what might become possible when we begin examining that fracture? Recovery can begin in surprisingly ordinary places. It might begin by sitting with your parents, talking to your grandparents, asking where the family came from, asking what their grandparents were called, asking what languages they spoke, ask why your surname is what it is. Ask about migrations, marriage customs, family traditions, old disputes, ceremonies, songs, proverbs, places that mattered. If they are comfortable with it, record those conversations, preserve photographs, write names on the backs of old pictures, because an unidentified photograph eventually becomes a picture of strangers. And when an elder dies, information that existed nowhere else can disappear with them. But family memory is only one layer. Go further. Read African history beyond slavery and colonialism. Study the kingdoms, states, communities, and trading networks that existed across the continent. Learn about Mali and Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, Aksum, Benin, Congo, the Swahili city-states, and then go beyond famous kingdoms. Study ordinary communities, agriculture, architecture, metallurgy, philosophy, languages, oral traditions, political systems, trade, migration, and importantly, compare sources. Read African scholars, read archaeology, read linguistics, read outsiders too, but understand the perspective from which they wrote. No historical source should automatically be treated as sacred. The objective is not to manufacture a glorious African mythology. It is to investigate. Memory without critical thinking becomes nostalgia. But critical thinking without memory can leave people intellectually homeless. And there is another danger. Recovering memory can itself become a trap if all we do is celebrate what our ancestors achieved. There is little value in spending our lives talking about what Africans built 500 or 1,000 years ago while building nothing meaningful for the generations that will come after us. Eventually, the question must change. Not only who were we, but what are we becoming? What knowledge are we producing? What businesses are we building? What institutions are we strengthening? What languages are we preserving? What technologies are we developing? What problems are we solving? What will African children inherit from us? Perhaps memory should function like roots. Roots do not force a tree backwards into the soil. They give it enough stability to grow upward. That, to me, is the purpose of historical memory, not to become our ancestors. We cannot. Their world is gone. The challenge is to understand enough about where we came from that we can engage the modern world consciously, rather than simply imitate whatever appears powerful at the moment. Learn from Africa. Learn from Europe. Learn from Asia. Learn from the Americas. Learn from everywhere. Human knowledge belongs to humanity. But encounter that knowledge from a position of intellectual confidence. A person who knows where they come from does not need to fear learning from somebody else. Perhaps the real tragedy of historical amnesia is not simply that we forget the past. It is that eventually we may lose the ability to imagine ourselves as authors of the future. And that brings me back to the original question. Can a civilization survive without memory? Perhaps it can survive. But can it fully understand itself? Can it confidently decide what to preserve, what to reject, and what to create? Can it know where it wants to go if it has only a fragmented understanding of where it has been? Those questions are at the heart of broken ancestry. If you would like to explore the argument further, the audiobook is available on Payhip, and the ebook/textbook edition is available on Amazon UK. And I want to leave you with one question. What is one piece of African cultural or historical memory that you believe the next generation cannot afford to lose? Leave your perspective in the comments. And if this conversation made you think, consider sharing it with someone who might bring another perspective to the discussion. Because perhaps recovering memory begins with something very simple, remembering enough to ask better questions about who we are and what we intend to become.